Ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome Tran and Ben Appleton.
Hello, I'm Tran. I'm product manager for Google Maps, and today I'm going to tell you about Mapplets. And so, mashup of mashups. Well, can you show the presentation, please? So, mashup of mashups. You'll hear us repeat this phrase over and over. That's because this whole project was motivated by this one scenario of looking for a house. So, a good place to start is this site called housingmaps.com. It was created by Paul Rademacher, and it was the first Google Maps mashup ever created. And what he did was he showed listings from Craigslist on a Google Maps site. Another criteria you might be interested in is whether this is a safe neighborhood or not. And it turns out the second Google Maps mashup ever created was a site called Chicago Crime, where it showed you where recent crime incidents had occurred in Chicago. And if you have kids, you probably care about what are the schools like in that neighborhood. And so there's yet another site called Great Schools that has school ratings and reviews. Now, you see there are three sites here. They all use the Google Maps API. But as a user, I would have to flip back and forth between them to get all the information I need. Secondly, that is assuming if users actually know that these sites exist. If you look at some of the top Maps API sites out there today, according to Nielsen Net Ratings, the top sites are getting about 1 to 2 million users per month. So this is orders of magnitude less than the amount of traffic that Google Maps is getting. But if you look at the things that users on Google Maps are searching for, they are looking for things like schools and real estate. So we need something to bridge that gap. And the solution is Mapplets. So this basically is a new programming model that enables you to take your mashups and build them as pieces that can be embedded within the Google Maps site. So currently, the only way for you to see Mapplets is to go to the special developer preview version of Google Maps at maps.google.com/preview. So I'm going to show you a demo now. So first thing you'll see when you get here is there's this new Mapplets tab, and there will be this button here to browse content. Now, we thought it was really important to have a gallery of all the possible content that you could add to Google Maps, because a lot of users really don't know what's available out there. But if they're looking for something specific, say weather, they, of course, can also search it. And adding it to Google Maps is really simple. It's basically just a single click and an Internet Explorer error. All right. OK, so I'm going to switch over to Firefox here. So first thing I'm going to do is we go back to that scenario of looking for a house in Chicago. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on the Chicago Crime Maplet. And let's look for where assaults have happened recently in Chicago. So that's what the purple markers are. And you'll notice they basically cluster in two neighborhoods over here. So I think I'm going to focus my search the north side of Chicago. So now I'm going to turn on the real estate search maplet. So one of the things the Mapplets infrastructure supports is storage of user preferences. So you'll notice this maplet here takes advantage of that, and it remembers the criteria that I'd entered previously. So I'm looking for a place for rent with at least 2 bedrooms for under $3,000. Now, when I click search, it's going to take the map viewport as well as my search parameters, and it's going to go talk to Google Base and pull out real estate listings from Google Base. So now, you can see basically, here's a place for $2,800 a month. And you see photos of it. Now, if I didn't have a car, something that might be really important to me is, how close is this to public transit? So I'm going to turn on this one maplet called the Chicago Transit Map. And what that does is it basically just shows a KML file that shows the CTA train lines in Chicago. Now, if I want to know specifically how far away one of these houses was from one of these stations, I can turn on this maplet called the distance measurement tool. And what this does is when I click on the map, it returns the locations that I click on back to the maplet. And in this case, this maplet then draws a polyline, and it tells me the total distance of that polyline. Another thing you'll notice is in the info windows, we automatically add links for driving directions and local search. So say if I'm looking for, what are the middle schools that are nearby? Right, so once again, this is the house I was looking at. And the red markers are the schools from the Google Local Search Index. And you see this is not a very highly rated school. But if I click to see more info here, you can see we've incorporated data on schools such as facts and reviews from greatschools.net directly into the local search index. And you can also see photos of the school right here. Now imagine, suppose I do have a car, so maybe I don't care so much about public transit, but something else that's pretty relevant these days is gas prices. So this is a maplet created by gasbuddy.com, and what this site does is they have users who basically drive around and report on the current prices of gas stations. Okay. And you see they're adding the cyan markers to the map. And you can see it's quite expensive to buy gas in this neighborhood. It's $3.99 a gallon. Okay. But if I go down and look at one of these other neighborhoods where there's a lot more crime, you'll notice something very interesting. Just waiting a second for it to load. Well, anyways, so you would have seen that the prices are significantly lower in this other neighborhood. So what exactly is a maplet? So we start with essentially the Google Gadgets API. And basically all that is just an iframe. You can put anything you want inside of it, HTML, JavaScript, Flash. It's just you can put anything that you can put into a regular web page. And then we give you a JavaScript API with some services such as access to remote data and storage of user preferences. And then we combine that with the Google Maps API, which then allows you to put your content on our maps as well as listen to events such as user clicks. And to show you how easy it is to write a maplet, this is all the source code necessary to write a hello world maplet. The stuff in gray is some XML wrapper that's necessary to be a gadget. This is just stuff that you cut and paste. The line in blue activates the Mapplets library, and the stuff in green is your content you put in there. So you can see it's just HTML and JavaScript. And the JavaScript we're running right here looks virtually identical to the Maps API. The first 3 lines basically get a handle to the map and then zooms out. And the second 3 line adds a marker and then adds an info window that says hello world. And I'm going to actually run this code right here. We have a special tool called the Scratchpad, which you can find in the gallery under the developer tools category. No. Right, and this allows you to interactively preview what a maplet would look like. So I'm going to enable the Scratchpad here. Network's being slow today. So I paste in the code. I click preview. And there you see it. There the maplet runs. So now I'm going to hand things over to Ben Appleton, who was the tech lead for this project, and he's going to tell you a little bit more about how Mapplets works. Okay.
Thanks, Ty. So as Ty mentioned, I'm Ben Appleton, the tech lead on Mapplets. Mapplets was a project developed in Sydney, for what it's worth, but Ty's actually based in Mountain View. So it's been interesting to build something of this size remotely in some sense. So what I'd like to talk to you about is some of the technology behind Mapplets and the implications that has for the Mapplets API. As much as possible, it's the same as the Maps API, but it's not exactly the same. And we'll see why that is in a second. So for starters, let's take a look at the high-level architecture of how Mapplets interact with the various servers at Google. So as Ty mentioned, Mapplets are a mashup of the Maps API and the Google Gadgets API. So they're essentially iGoogle gadgets, remote gadgets, which are hosted on maps.google.com. So it all begins with a user pointing their browser at Google Maps and downloading the HTML, the CSS, the JavaScript, the map tiles that make up Google Maps. Now let's say they then navigate to the Mapplets tab and click through to see a maplet. Now what the browser does at this point, the JavaScript creates an iframe. This iframe is hosted on a domain gmodules.com, and this is the domain used for Google modules, Google gadgets. Now the reason for this is that by making an iframe, we can let developers, that's all of you, put anything you want into that iframe, and it can't do anything evil to the page. So it's essentially a very secure way of including content from third-party sites. And so we feel confident as Google to include arbitrary third-party content like this onto a very popular site like maps.google.com, and we're not threatening the security of users. It's also a caching proxy. The first thing it does is it goes off to your server and downloads what's called our module spec. It's an XML specification. Ty showed an example on the previous slide, which it's essentially an XML wrapper around a chunk of HTML and CSS and JavaScript, which gets loaded into that iframe. The content really isn't changed much at all. you're welcome to take a look at the contents of the iframe to see just how little we do to your content before we show it. At the same time as loading your content from the server, and of course we cache it so as not to hammer your server, we also load any preferences that the user has for that particular maplet. So we have an internal service in Google which allows us to store personal data in a very secure manner. And we go to this service, we request any user preferences any preferences the user has for that particular maplet, and we combine the two and send this back to the user. Ooh, smiling happy user there. So that's essentially how the content makes it from within Google and from your server down into the browser. Now, as I mentioned, it's important that we put this inside of an iframe in a different domain for security reasons. But having done that, the same function, the same sort of features of the browser, which make it a secure way to include content, also prevent it from talking to the map. And so it wouldn't be very useful to have a gadget on the maps page which didn't talk to the map. It's kind of a waste of space then, perhaps. So we managed to figure out, and this was sort of the big technical obstacle in Mapplets, we managed to figure out a way to communicate between iframes in different domains inside the browser. And so I'd like to explain to you in brief how that works. The first thing we do, when you make a call to the Mapplets API, for example, you might say map.setCenter, latitude, longitude. This is a fairly classic way of moving the map to see some particular point. That function call becomes a string. Quite literally becomes map1, comma, setCenter, comma, some latitude, some longitude. So we just make a string out of your data, and then we ship that over to the map iframe, to the main page. If you make several calls in a row, then rather than sending one packet at a time, we actually bulk them together. So we've taken a lot of pains to become very efficient in this way. As a result, you tend to find that Mapplets are very responsive. Now, the way that we actually send strings between these two iframes, that is from the maplet to the map, is that the maplet creates an iframe which is hosted on maps.google.com. This iframe is a special iframe which has a very small chunk of JavaScript inside of it. As well as creating that iframe with a particular URL, we also attach to it a hash fragment. And it's a hash symbol followed by a large packet of data that we want to send across to the map. When the iframe loads, the JavaScript in the iframe is executed. It looks at the window.location.hash, extracts that packet out of the URL, and because it is in the same domain as maps.google.com, it can then pass it to the map. Now, to support all of this, we have two JavaScript libraries. One is called the stub library. It lives inside, it's loaded into that maplet iframe. And one is called the host library. It is loaded into maps.google.com. And these know, on the one hand, how to turn these Maps API calls, these maplet calls, into strings, and on the other hand, how to expand them out again and actually do something to the map, perform the operation that you've requested. And there's some went ahead a bit farther. There's some really nifty advantages to using the hash as a way to send packets around. For one, the hash fragment of a URL is never actually sent in a GET request. So what happens is the browser, when it goes to fetch the content of that little iframe, that communication iframe there, what it does, it strips off the hash, keeps it for its own use, but sends to the server a request to get that particular iframe. Now, after you've made the very, very first communication request, every request thereafter hits the browser's cache because it's the same URL. So it means the communication is incredibly fast, on the order of 30 milliseconds or so to send data across to the map. Certainly not something the user is going to notice. And this is what makes it fast. And there's also another side benefit here that I think is really good for our users, that there's sort of a strong guarantee here that Google is not sniffing the content of how you're interacting with the map. We just can't. It's purely communication within the browser. So that's fundamentally how Mapplets talk to the map. Now, that has some ramifications for how the Mapplets API works, and it's a little bit different to the Maps API. In as much as possible, we've kept it the same because we think it's a really valuable thing to have this body of users who know the Maps API JavaScript fairly well and are familiar with it. And so we've kept it the same as much as possible. But something you probably, you might have considered by now is that because we're sending packets back and forward, it's a little bit like a client-server interaction, like you're doing XML HTTP requests or GET requests against a server. You don't get your response immediately. You get it a short time later. In fact, in some browsers, the two iframes might be running JavaScript under different threads, for example. So when, for example, in the Maps API, you would have written var zoom equals map.getZoom, that zoom value is available to you immediately upon calling .getZoom on the map. Unfortunately, in Mapplets, that's not the case. Under the hood, this becomes a data packet. It gets sent across to the map the map evaluates it, computes its zoom level, and sends that back to the maplet as the response to the request. And so it actually comes in a short time later, as I mentioned, maybe 30 milliseconds later. So instead of actually taking a return value, all the functions in the Maps API, which used to take a return value, now take a function instead. And when the zoom level eventually arrives, that zoom level is passed to your function. So what we see here is side-by-side examples of how to use the Maps API to interrogate the map versus how to use Mapplets to interrogate the map. Now, it turns out to be very easy to convert from one to the other. Many JavaScript programmers are used to dealing with closures when you're talking to a server or making a request against some remote service somewhere. And in fact, in testing of Mapplets, we've converted dozens of Maps API sites by hand into Mapplets, and we find this to be a very straightforward thing to do. So that's the big fundamental difference between the Mapplets API in some sense and the Maps API. Apart from that, they're almost the same. A couple of further differences. For one, this is just a user interface issue, it just makes sense. In the case of the Maps API, you own the map, your site owns the map, you've put it inside a div of your choosing, and you get to control how it behaves. If you want to, you can turn off you can turn off continuous zooming, you can turn off panning, you can turn off dragging of the map, all these various things. Whereas on maps.google.com, obviously we don't want some rogue maplet somewhere disabling dragging for users, because then the users would be really confused, they'd try to drag the map, they might have half a dozen maplets open and not be sure which one had shut down the dragging of the map. Just a bad user experience. So as a result, we've disabled some of those behavior changing method calls. Secondly, there's some security limitations on what we can do with developers' code. So because we are, in essence, we're allowing a third-party website, this little iframe here, to control the behavior of the map. There's limitations on what we allow to run under the maps.google.com domain in order to ensure security for our users. Parts of the Maps API, in particular custom controls and custom map types, are based upon an abstract interface class in JavaScript, which an advanced developer will implement themselves. They'll provide the JavaScript to do things such as computing the URL of a tile to load for a custom tile layer. And it's that JavaScript which we can't support, unfortunately. So what we do for these cases is we've dropped these custom controls from the Mapplets API, as opposed to the Maps API. And over time, particularly in conversation with our users and developers, because we're still in a developer preview at this point, we'll figure out other ways to resolve these and give you the full functionality of the Maps API. There's a second limitation too on what we can show in the info window. So certainly in the Maps API, you can put anything you want in the info window. You can have click handlers, you can have chunks of flash or all sorts of tricky stuff like this. In Mapplets, in the Mapplets API, once again, we've had to remove what might be considered rogue JavaScript from the info window contents. So for example, if you have a click handler on a div which you put inside the info window, that click handler gets stripped off on its way from the maplet over to the map. We found this is not a serious limitation for what it's worth. But I have already noticed that at least two fairly keen Maplet authors have figured out another way to implement info windows using iframes. And so what they do is, to be able to show anything at all that you want in the info window, one way to do it is to put an iframe in the info window, which points to your site. You construct in the maplet the URL of this info window with the appropriate CGI parameters to make a request to your server, and back comes rich content in the info window. And that can do things such as interact securely with your web server because it's under the same domain. There's no concerns about cross-site scripting there. And you can do things like have fairly complicated forms allowing you to book a hotel or do a search against your backends and all this kind of stuff. So not for the faint of heart, but something to consider if you find the info window implementation in Mapplets to be limiting. So in some sense, that's all I had to say about Mapplets specifically. Now, I'd like to talk a bit more about some general good practice in using the Maps API, which is particularly beneficial in Mapplets. Something you see a lot in Maps API sites, particularly sort of amateur sites, and this is certainly something I'm guilty of, when I wrote my first Maps API site, is that you have a bunch of data and you want to show the world your data. And so what you do is you embed in your JavaScript a chunk of, like a huge table of data. I mean, we've only included 3 points of interest here, but you can imagine that you might have 1,000 points of interest that you want to be able to show on the map. So you build this giant table, and then the next step after that is you, one by one, create markers for those points of interest, create info windows that will show up when you click on them, and so on. Now, this is a lot of work, and it's also got a number of, there's a number of reasons why you wouldn't want to do this anyway. For one, it's always a good design pattern, if you like, to separate your data from your functionality. It means that one day, if you find a new set of points of interest and you want to display them instead, then you should be able to just plug and play this new data set into your functionality. Or on the other hand, if you have a really, really good data set and someone else wants to reuse it, it would just be really useful for a separate file that they could access and show using their own functionality. And so we'd recommend separating these. And if you're going to separate your data from your functionality, you might as well do it right and use a standard format. So Google Maps now has fairly good support for GRSS, and it's had support for KML for quite a long time now. We'd recommend either of these two standard formats, pick your poison, as a way of representing your data. Now, there's a few advantages to this. One is that it's immediately easy for someone else to reuse your data because it's in a standard format. Another advantage is that, and I'll show you in a second, you actually get some code written for you for free as part of the API. And this is a recent object we've added to the API. But there's actually another advantage as well, which is that Google knows how to interpret these two data formats. And so if you have a high-quality source of data that's of interest to users, and it's in KML or it's in GRSS, then the Google indexer will, as we crawl all the various websites and come across KML and GRSS files, we'll add them to our index. And when someone performs a search on Google Maps, up may come your data. So for example, maybe you've got a treasure trove of where are all the ATMs in the US. And so you've carefully maintained this data. It's really high-quality stuff. You get a lot of traffic to your site just by making it available as KML or GRSS. Because when users go to Google Maps and search for ATMs in the Bay Area, we know to look at your data and consider it as a possible source of data for the user. And if it's a good source of data, then we'll show it to the user. They can see an attribution to your site, and your traffic may just shoot through the roof. So to give an example now of how we should have written that previous chunk of JavaScript, first, we represent our data using a standard format. Here we've chosen to display KML. Both KML and GRSS are fairly simple. We have a collection of what are called place marks. Each is assigned a name and a coordinate that we want to display that place mark at. Okay. So then your code becomes incredibly easy. For those of you who haven't used the Maps API, it might have looked really complicated to make a point, make a marker out of the point, add the marker to the map. Oh, forgot to make the map. Add a click listener, and when someone clicks on the listener, open an info window. It just magically happens for you if you use this new GeoXML object that we've added to the API. This was added a couple of months ago. And there's also other advantages to using the GeoXML object. It's clever enough to know that if you load 1,000 points, then it won't display them all. As the user pans and zooms in and zooms out, it will show the most relevant ones to them. And so there's a lot of magic, JavaScript magic that's happening behind the scenes that makes for a better user experience if you use this standard tool. And we'll be continuing to extend the GeoXML object over time. There's yet one more advantage for using GeoXML object in Mapplets. And that is that if you load the data yourself into the Mapplet iframe and then attempt to send it across to the Maps page, that could take a while because of the communication bottleneck there. Whereas if you load a GeoXML object, you just tell the map, I would like to see this feed on the map, and up it comes. So it's more efficient in that respect. Ooh. Okay, so we see Mapplets as part of a broader picture at Google, for Google Maps particularly. Something we hear being called the GeoWeb. I'm not sure how much I like that term, but it's certainly something which is emerging. At the very entry level of Google Maps, your ma and pa, it's easy to go to Google Maps and just start using this new feature we have called My Maps, which we launched a couple of months ago. So, drag and drop markers around, use a rich HTML editor. You don't need to know any HTML. You just start flagging things as bold and italicized and so on. So you have a really nice WYSIWYG editor for simple stuff on the map that matters to you. Now, at the same time, it's kind of limited. You can only really create small maps by hand. Once you get past 100 points or so, it just doesn't scale that well in some sense, just doing it by hand. So, and there's another limit too, in that your data really can't move around. And there is some really interesting data that moves around. Let's say, for example, a feed of all the taxis in the Bay Area, or something like that. you'd love to see something that refreshes every minute or two. And that's when you really move beyond My Maps and you start using KML. Now, you can actually export My Maps data to KML, so that might be a good way to start. And then from there, you can start maintaining larger and larger KML files as your data grows, as your database grows larger. If you have a dynamic feed, for example, you might have a website which scrapes the positions of all the taxis in the US from another website somewhere else. And that might be in plain text or some horrible format. You can then serve that data as a standard format, be that GRSS or KML. It doesn't matter so much. Once you start doing that, you've really moved beyond what you can do by hand to starting to really take advantage of these standards and start some of the support that sites like Google Maps has for it. And as another advantage, if you have your data in the format KML, then you can easily show your data on Google Earth and really impress clients and other such people. But at the same time, there's a limit to what KML can do. At some point, you've drawn polylines and polygons on the map. You've put some images on the map and some markers, and you can click on these things and get info windows which have HTML content in them. But that's restricted in the sense that you can't do the really interesting applications that move past that. In some sense, you're just scrolling, looking at data. What you'd really like to do when you have a lot of data is to start providing more functionality as a front end to that data. Like a really nice user interface, the ability to search through subsets of that data, these sorts of things you just can't do in KML. So the next step beyond that we see is to use Mapplets and the Maps API. We see this as two parallel and useful things. I wouldn't recommend, for example, that if you had a really large Maps API website, that you shut it down and make it a Maplet. That would be kind of silly. But there's lots of advantages to using a Maplet. So a Maplet has a fixed chunk of real estate on maps.google.com, which might be getting 100 times as much traffic as your site would. And it's much more easily discoverable to users to be able to go to the catalog, search for hotels or whatever it is they're after, and find a bunch of good Mapplets, add them to the page and start using that. So you're really much, much more discoverable when you use Mapplets than you are using the Maps API. Having said that, there is a restricted amount of screen real estate. There's a few operations in the Maps API that aren't supported in Mapplets, at least for now. And so it's really advantageous to consider having a Maplet, which gives something like a preview of what your site can offer, and then gives you links that you can click through to see your site, maybe to actually book a hotel or whatever it might be. And so this is sort of the vision that we see emerging in the future of working with Google Maps as developers. And we hope that you all enjoy what we've given you today with Mapplets. And I guess now we'll switch over to questions. Thank you.
Go to the next slide. Oh, sorry. Flip to the next slide.
I do have one question.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah?
You talked about having a large KML file, and that Maps is smart enough to show, I think you said the most relevant points when you have very many, when you zoom out.
Yeah.
Could you explain what you meant by relevant? How does it rank them, or how does it know what to display?
So for now, at least, the relevance is measured heuristically. It's a little bit simplistic. It's basically, if you seem to have a lot of info window content describing that particular marker, then we deem that it's more important. Over time, we hope to improve that, though. I mean, this is just a heuristic, right? So we could, for example, look at how much similar content is turning up in other KML files. It might turn out to be a very important feature that you're displaying there.
Okay, so any concept of me being able to dictate relevance there? In other words, in my KML, to give you a hint to what I think is important?
That's an interesting idea. So KML's just been, I believe we've just handed over control of it to
OGC?
OGC, exactly right. So this is actually something maybe that we should take up with them as something that's really useful to developers.
Yeah. Good, thanks.
No worries.
Next question?
Howdy. I got a follow-up question with the large KML database. Is there a way to implement like a geodatabase like Esri has, where you can search for a specific region, California, without having to split up your data into hierarchical regions? Instead of dropping down the whole KML file with 1 million points, can I just regionally select?
I believe there's a recent feature added to KML, right, where you can split things into regions.
You can actually break your KML file up into what are called regions in KML parlance. And this might be something like a quad tree or per postcode or something like that. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, but you still have to download the whole KML file.
No,
it
it's
will
smart,
split
it's
it
smart
up.
enough to know to only download this segment that is relevant to your current viewport.
Okay, thank you.
Can you do the mic?
For the region, I was wondering it's only supported in Google Earth to switch to react to region change.
I'm sorry, I missed that.
When you change the regions, I was wondering if it's not just supported in Google Earth to react to region events.
I'd have to look into that. I'm not sure, actually. Sorry.
Yeah, I believe that currently, I mean, if it's not supported right today, we are in the process of adding that support to Google Maps. I mean, I think the goal is to have Google Maps have the equivalent functionality as Google Earth,
Definitely.
except for the 3D stuff.
Really? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Does the Mapplets interface allow custom overlays, like custom markers and things like that?
Yes.
You can
If
certainly-
you saw the demo I gave this morning, when I showed WeatherBug, they actually had custom icons. They actually showed the current temperature as the icon.
I'm interested in embedding my maps in my own website in a maplet. Is that something you guys have plans for, with ability to export to a KML file and pass it on to a different system?
You're talking about the My Maps feature? Yeah. When you're viewing a My Map, you'll see a link in the top right that says KML. When you click on that, that will export the data as KML. And then,
If I wanted to have that in my own system, in my own website, is that something that can be packaged? And
Yeah, exactly. If we go back to our slide on GGXML, basically, can you show the slides?
So if we can switch over to slides.
Right. So basically, you can just you can put this code into your Maps API site, and you just point that to the URL of the KML file.
So if you wanted the editor within the website,
The editor.
Oh, the editor itself. Oh,
Not-
yeah. So yeah, that feature is not yet available.
is there plans for it?
I don't think we can comment on future features.
Yeah, I believe that one of the most powerful things about Google Maps is the network link, that is the network links that are possible. And I've noticed that a good example is with housingmaps.com. It's not very searchable, or the network links aren't very easy to find. It took me a long time to find housing maps, and when I did, I was blown away. So I was wondering if there's a good way, or I'd like to suggest, to increase the power to search for network links.
Like we mentioned earlier, one of the things that Google now is doing is when we crawl the web, every time we discover a KML file, we now fully index it.
Now, when I currently go to Google Maps and I search for something, it'll currently just give results that are static results, certain points that are already there.
Yeah.
But if my network link gives me dynamic results, it won't show up, as far as I know.
Okay, so I think what happens is when you do a search in Google Maps, we'll return you some representative points from that layer. And then once you find one of those points, there's a link for you to basically turn on the entire layer. And when you do that, then you will get the network links.
Okay. I guess that makes sense. With a site like Housing Maps, where every single point there is dynamic, or it goes and crawls Craigslist to get the data, then when you search for it, if you search for a house in whatever area, as far as I know, Housing Maps won't return any results. And so I think it would be a really good implementation to allow searching of any network link. I kind of see network links as a certain type of web page. And so, but they're kind of hidden. They're hard to search. And so I would at least suggest to increase the searching capacity for those. Or if there already is one, tell us how.
Yeah, I mean, this is part of the motivation for why we created Mapplets, right? Is because there are all these dynamic data sources that we can't index, right? And so So Mapplets is a way of sort of getting this data in front of users who are searching for it on Google Maps.
Great. Thanks.
No worries.
In the back?
Yeah, I was wanting to know about, in the situation you were showing Chicago, what if you passed a KML that had data points outside of Chicago? Does the map expand back, or because it's KML, you're able to just automatically parse what's not in that region of the map?
I believe when you load a KML file, we will zoom out to show the entire
so
balance.
if you were to take, if you had a link to that KML file to be shown on Google Maps with a Q equals that URL file, or if you type that into the search box, then it would actually zoom out to the search box when it first got loaded. With the GeoXML object, that's still kind of new, and so we're interested to hear feedback there. I don't know if people want the map to automatically zoom out to see the whole of the file, or if they'd rather be more efficient and just show the content which is inside the current bounds. So expect to see some changes, I guess, in the API, particularly for the GeoXML object, as we hear from developers like yourself.
Over there?
Yes, John Corrier at maps.huge.info. You mentioned that in the custom tile overlay, you strip out the JavaScript. What about in gtile overlay? Will you pass the JavaScript that generates the URL to Mapplets, or?
So yeah, that's right. We don't support gtile overlay at this point. We're looking into ways to do it. We can't do it by using inheritance of JavaScript classes, which is how it works now. But we've actually been considering and talking to a few people about the possibility of extending the API to take another way of constructing a gtile overlay, which is by, say, for example, a string which has a substring for the latitude and longitude and the zoom, and then we can just replace that on the fly. And that would be trustworthy, something we could do in Maps and not have to worry about the fact that a maplet provided that URL. So we're looking at ways to solve this problem. We just haven't solved it right now.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Another question I had is would you think it'd be possible to insert the Mapplets on Google Maps API enabled site, so I can add other people at Mapplets to my?
Yeah, so that is not
sites.
currently supported because we're just in the beginning phases, but that is part of our vision.
Yeah, we think it'd be really cool.
Because you can do that today with gadgets. You can take gadgets, any gadget, put it on your page, and our goal is to make it so that Mapplets also are syndicatable, so that you run a Maps API site, say you do real estate, you focus on your core competency, which is real estate, and then you can add Mapplets from other people who are the best in public transit or weather or crimes, and so you don't have to worry about those other things. So I think this is where things get really powerful, because then every time somebody creates a new maplet, the whole community gets better, because it's suddenly one new capability that every Maps API site gains. All right, any other questions? All right, well, thank you very much.